Howdy folks, just a quick note up front that this video will contain full spoilers for God of War 2018. Also, if you're enjoying my content, please consider commenting on the video, dropping a like on it, or subscribing to my channel. Thanks very much, on with the review. So, given that March and April of 2020 feel like they've been approximately a decade long each, I was super surprised to find out that God of War was only on its second birthday. That is, God of War 4. We are once again being screwed around with numerically here. Mind you, in this case it's more forgivable than most. It was probably someone from marketing pleading with them not to put the 4 on the end, because, God forbid, we have a long-standing narrative franchise going that doesn't let new folks jump on at every single point, I guess. But God of War 2018 is certainly a departure from its predecessors. I loved God of War 3, but it was problematic. There's still catharsis to be gotten from ripping and tearing everything until there's nothing left. Doom Eternal reminded us of that recently. But playing a character without a single redeeming feature who would maim and torture anything that got in his path, including those entirely innocent, was starting to get into that kind of postal Grand Theft Auto groove. That "we're edgy, please complain about us" to the Daily Mail and to various politicians area that I really despise. It's so needy. So it did come as a total surprise to me that when I played God of War 4, it's actually a heartwarming story of a father trying to raise his son after the death of his mother. During the first game, God of War 2005, yeah, it was 15 years ago, sorry about that folks, Kratos was a character that went through the full arc of a Grecian tragedy, finding out that no matter how mighty his deeds, he could never escape himself. That's something that got lost a little in 2 and 3, not to mention the handheld games, but I think it's brought back amazingly here.
The truth. I am a god, boy. From another land far from here.
Kratos hates who he was, but he knows it's not something he can ever really escape. He wants to protect his son Atreus from the gods, and he knows that means protecting him from himself and the worst parts of his son's own nature too. As the father to a young son, it's very relatable. As much of a pleasant surprise as the plot was, it would have fallen flat on its face if it weren't aided by the game's brilliant voice work.
Listen to me and not speak a word. I am your father, and you, boy, are not yourself. You are too quick to temper. You are rash, insubordinate, and out of control. This will not stand. You will honor your mother and abandon this path you have chosen. It is not too late. This discussion is far from over. We are here because of you, boy. Never forget that.
I have loved Christopher Judge since he was this handsome slab of beef in Stargate, and I think he's actually even stronger here than he was there. Jeremy Davis as Balder, the game's antagonist, does an amazing job as well, and it would be impossible not to love, I'm going to murder this, Sonny Suljic, I think, as Atreus. There are moments where Atreus will, for usually very good reason, become kind of sullen or in a sulk with you, and either won't aid you in combat or will just do his own thing and won't listen to instruction. You can usually tell that's coming from the voice work. Also, lest I make the game sound entirely depressing, it's got a great sense of humour about it too. Let's just have a listen to a couple of clips here.
Others be warned. The tunnels I'm seeing in the walls up here show signs of recent dragon activity.
We already killed that dragon.
Oh, look at that. Well, how'd that go?
If she can't bring it back to life, can we keep the head?
No. But you may feed it to the fish.
Okay.
See, I love those, especially that last one. It just comes straight out of nowhere and makes me laugh every time. Also serving the plot is the game's character animation. There are moments early on where Kratos clearly wants to comfort his son over the death of his mother and doesn't feel able to. And this is done without use of the excellent voice acting, it's done entirely wordlessly. But it still comes off as absolutely heartbreaking, especially this moment I'm showing right now. I also especially love this shot of Kratos pleading for aid when Atreus gets sick later on in the game. You can see the fear of losing his son, and it's not an emotion I would ever have imagined seeing on Kratos' face. It's very convincing. When we're on the subject of looks, the whole game looks incredible. The environments are amazing. We've traded Greek mythology from the other games for Norse mythology here, and the game has really run with that style. It's built into everything you look and see, all of the architecture, all of the creatures, even the menus. One of my personal favourites in terms of the graphics is when you're travelling between realms. Bear in mind, folks, this is a loading screen, but the sequence gives you the feel of movement and extremely powerful magic at work here. Honestly, graphically, I don't think the game puts a foot wrong. Of course, all that said, what does the game actually play like? Well, those that were looking for a fourth God of War need not have worried all that much. That immensely satisfying hack-and-slash combat is still there, although if you want to use the Blades of Chaos, you're going to have to wait till about 2/3 of the way through the game, which was an interesting decision. Instead of that, you start out with a shield and a magical axe that returns to you Thor's hammer style when you throw it. And that was a genius move. If you don't find the action of throwing that axe and calling it back immensely satisfying, I recommend you get yourself checked for a sense of fun. Seriously. Also, the game now has an RPG element, which allows you to purchase new skills, which is not new to the series, but you can also upgrade your weapons and armor here. Although, that said, ironically, this is the first chink in the game's armor where I'm concerned. As I say, purchasing new skills has always been something you could do in God of War, and that works for the most part, but I only really ever felt the bow skills were useful. I did have that experience with the previous God of War games as well, though, so that could just be me. Likewise, you can also get runes that give you special attacks or buffs that you put on your axe and on the Blades of Chaos, but the big problem with those is the first one you get is by far and away the best one. I used the first one for most of the game. I literally swapped it out to check the other ones, used them for about 30 seconds, and then went right back to it. Even if I'm using the Blades of Chaos, I will swap to the axe to use the light rune on it, and then swap back to the blades. In addition to that, the system for upgrading your armor is a bit long-winded, and there's this odd leveling and stat system tied into it. So you don't level up using XP, that's for your moves. You level up based on the power of your gear and the stats that it's giving you. It's important as well because enemies do now have levels. I was never sure if the levels represented how I would do relative to the gear I was wearing, or if the level difference with the enemy mattered. It isn't really all that well explained. On the subject of things not being that well explained as well, the dwarves in charge of the upgrades will occasionally give you a Mark of the Dwarves. It changes the look of the axe, but I've no idea if it actually does anything else, and the game wasn't interested in telling me. You do actually have a level up for the axe, but that's separate to this, so I was kind of confused. None of this is bad, it's certainly not a deal breaker, but it's all needlessly complicated. The game is at its best when you're fighting enemies and running around with your kid climbing and exploring. In terms of the gameplay, worthy of their own special mention are the boss battles. Some of them. The initial fight with Baldur in this game might be my favourite boss fight of all time. It starts off on a small, basic level, and it feels almost like a tutorial fight. It's only really the first real boss fight in the game. But it keeps upping the ante until you reach this feeling of two gods doing battle against each other. And what's even more impressive about it is that it manages to bring that scale back down and finishes off with a Greco-Roman wrestling move. It's a great nod to Kratos not really being able to leave his past behind. It's a nice story beat. Also worthy of note when it comes to story beats is the fight with the honest-to-God's dragon. Now, God of War has always been amazing at doing large scale, and this fight isn't an exception to that. But the main thing I like about it is the couple of story beats in there where Kratos is finally learning to trust Atreus, his son.
We have to help him.
Break right. Find an angle. Wait for my mark.
Thank you.
The fight is also delightfully gooey. It might have been difficult to make me believe that I was actually taking down a dragon, but the graphics here actually really do make you believe. It's amazing. Sadly though, there is a downside to this. Because these two fights are so good, and in fairness, all of the fights with Baldur are pretty spectacular, the rest of the boss fights in the game just kind of come off as meh. In particular, fighting Thor's sons, Magni and Modi. I said Baldur was making you feel like two gods were doing battle. They make you feel like you're outside a bar on a Saturday night dealing with a pair of drunken asshats. The funny thing is, I know that's what the game is shooting for with these two as well. They're pathetic bullies, but it doesn't make for a good boss fight, even if it's a great story note. Also, weird note when it comes to fighting boss fights and some stronger enemies. When you grab an enemy but you aren't going to instantly kill them, you get the option for performing either a heavy attack or a light attack. Now, the game has the standard rules for these. Light attack does a quick attack that does less damage, heavy attack is slower but does more. But in terms of when I have an enemy grabbed, I never really understood what the benefits of using one over the other were. It's not that the enemy counters if you do one over the other, so what good does picking light attack do over heavy? Also, a last note on the combat. I know the Rage of Sparta, or whatever the Berserk meter has been called in the game, is a series staple, but I actually think it's a little misused in this one. To be clear, when Kratos uses this as part of the story, usually when Atreus is in some life-threatening danger, those are great. When we see him call upon the power of being the god of war to try and save his son, that's amazing. But then I can just charge it up in combat and kind of use it whenever I want, and that dumps on those story moments. I think I'd have been better if they'd just left it as something that only got charged when Atreus was in danger. So what about when you aren't fighting in the game? Well, the game's gone open world, but it has made that transition so much more smoothly than so many other games out there. There are hidden items everywhere, and some are certainly easier to spot on a second playthrough than the others when you've got some kind of feel for what the puzzles are like. The game also has New Game Plus if you're into that sort of thing for that. And the puzzles in the game do increase in difficulty on a fairly natural curve, although occasionally I found that executing the solution was more fiddly than just finding out what it was, and I'm no fan of that when it comes to puzzles in games. Outside of the story missions as well, there are some optional missions, including a couple of entirely optional realms. For once I do mean totally optional as well. It might be the trade-off for like the weird item system, but you really don't need to go anywhere near the optional zones or quest, and you'll still be fine for completing the main story. It's what I did on my playthrough this time around. I don't recommend skipping the Valkyrie fights once you find them though. Those are some really tough, rewarding fights. I personally can't actually finish all of them, but I try every one I find because they are just some of the best fights in the game. They're completely optional, but it'd be a shame to miss them. A couple of things just towards the end of the review here as well that I couldn't really find a space for, but I absolutely wanted to mention. The Bifrost Crystal. Mostly a plot device, it's also a better torch than 90% of torches in video games. It gives great light, it doesn't run out, it actually illuminates the darkness around you. That's just brilliant. Why can't we have more torches like this in games? Mind you, it is a little bit weird. We get this huge lecture about not losing the crystal, and then we don't. Actually, while I'm on weird bits and pieces of praise for the game, controller vibration. It's not something I normally consider one way or the other when it comes to whether a game's good or bad, but the game actually makes fantastic use of it when you're meeting something big. The World Serpent is the one that springs to mind here. They absolutely cranked the motors in the controller up to 11, and it had a huge impact on how epic that moment felt. I suppose maybe controller vibration is something you don't often notice if it's done well, but it was really noticeably good here. It's probably also the only time in a review I'm ever going to get to compliment controller vibration. So yeah, God of War really surprised me when it came out, and I can honestly say, during a third playthrough here, that it absolutely holds up on multiples as well. That might be to do with those optional missions being optional. Being able to just do the story is actually pretty wonderful if you're into doing multiple playthroughs or something. And yeah, there just isn't a lot to fault here. The writing's on point, the combat's rewarding, the world is stunningly beautiful. The only thing after 2 years that really sticks in my craw is the cliffhanger ending we get. It's not the game's fault at all, really. They're a staple of video games to an extent, and TV and movies. I've just never been that big a fan of them. Plus, it's been 2 years, and I would really, really love to hear about more God of War. Till then, I guess there's always a fourth playthrough. Hey folks, thanks for watching through to the end of the video here. Again, if you enjoyed the video, please do drop a like on it, as that helps hugely with YouTube's search algorithm. If you'd like to drop me a comment and tell me what you thought, that would be welcome as well. And please consider subscribing to the channel if you did enjoy the video. If you would like to follow me on Twitter to see what I'm going to be doing a video on next, you can do that on the link you see on your screen there. I also have a Patreon set up. There are no tiers or anything, it's just there if you'd like to contribute to help me keep the lights on around here. And you can see the link to that on your screen as well. I will see you all next week. Until then, peace. I'm out.